Welcome back, everyone. It is now time for this year's high-level talk session titled Dialogue Between Philosophy and Science Towards a New Enlightenment. In the face of pandemics, wars, and environmental crises, our society needs a new and better way of thinking about its problems. We will re-examine the role of ethics in science, aiming beyond Anthropocene thinking, and bringing philosophy and science together. And we will search an approach that embraces all organisms and the environment. Let me introduce NAKAJIMA Takahiro, who will moderate this session from Hamburg, Germany. He is professor of the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia and director of the East Asian Academy for New Liberal Arts at the University of Tokyo. So, Professor Nakajima, can you hear me?
Yes. Hello, everyone in Tokyo. Thank you for your kind introduction to me. I am Takahiro Nakajima, the moderator of this high-level talk session today. So I and Professor Markus GABRIEL are now in the new institute, Hamburg in Germany. So let me introduce you our four distinguished guests. So the first speaker is Professor Markus GABRIEL. He is the director of International Center for Philosophy at the University of Bonn and academic director here at the new institute. He is an outstanding German philosopher, famous for his theory of new realism and new existentialism. So now he advocates the new enlightenment here in Hamburg. The second speaker is Professor Hiroshi Oguri. He is the director of Kavli Institute for the Physics and Mathematics of the Universe at the University of Tokyo, and Fred Kavli Professor and the director Walter Berg Institute for Theoretical Physics at California Institute of Technology. He is a worldly well-known physicist. So the third speaker is Professor Sukje Lee. He is now in Tokyo. His major is Enlightenment theory in Europe. So he is a dean of the College of Humanities at Seoul National University. And the fourth speaker is Professor Sayaka Oki. She is a historian of science, and she is very famous for her book on the divergence between science and humanities and social sciences. So we are very pleased to have these distinguished speakers to have a dialogue between philosophy and science, thinking of the new enlightenment. Okay, so the first speaker is Professor Markus GABRIEL. Professor GABRIEL, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Nakajima. Dear distinguished hosts of this wonderful event, dear distinguished colleagues and members of our panel. So today I will argue in the brevity of time to a certain extent superficially that the new Enlightenment, the era that I think is about to begin, delivers new modes of cooperation of philosophy and the other sciences in light of a particular understanding of what it is to do the right thing. That is, in light of understanding normativity as it runs through the socially and naturally complex systems that are evidently in crisis right now. So my brief talk will first clarify the concept of moral realism. Then I will talk about human co-becoming as the locus of responsibility, that is the origin of ethical and scientific thinking, which will then lead me to a sketch for how to achieve a new form of universality based on transcultural and transdisciplinary cooperation. So let's start. First, let me briefly say what I think philosophy is, and then I move from there to the nature of ethics and normativity. Philosophy is a science of science, a science, and the object of philosophy is human thinking as such, which is why logics and fundamental mathematics, among other disciplines, very early already originated from philosophical thinking, and we have seen various periods of the production of new modes of realizing philosophical thinking about thinking in the shape of science, technology, and politics. These are, of course, all concepts that historically derive from philosophical thinking and then turn into specific disciplines with a proper orientation. So that's what philosophy is, thinking about thinking, or science about science, or as we might simply say, philosophy is the science. Now to ethics, which is, increasingly important in our highly complex world facing intertwined and nested crises. I think ethics is the subdiscipline of philosophy which studies the nature, scope, and structure of moral facts. That claim is called ethical realism. A moral fact is a true answer to a meaningful question concerning what we ought to do simply in virtue of our shared humanities and the duties, obligations, and rights that derive from the status of being human. And as we will see, that status can only be realized by co-becoming human. So again, a moral fact is a true answer to a meaningful question concerning what we owe to each other simply in virtue of our shared humanity, and what we therefore also owe to non-human animals and the rest of nature as far as we can understand it. So ethics is about that. That claim is moral realism. It means that ethics is in the business of discovering how things are in the human realm. So ethics has its proper domain of facts that it studies, but it can only, as we will see in a minute, uncover its facts through strong cooperation across all scientific disciplines and even across many sectors of society. So this leads me to the second element of the New Enlightenment, as I understand it, namely humanism. Here, humanism does not at all mean anthropocentrism, let alone some more objectionable form this could take, such as Eurocentrism, etc. So humanity has been decentered through various waves in modernity. We have heard about some of them, the scientific revolution, and most recently, the AI and life science revolution. So the idea that humans are, in an interesting sense, at the center of anything turned out to be meaningless. But that precisely led to the insight that we are responsible for how things are with the ecological niche that we construct in virtue of living together. That is, facts about the human animal and its presence on planet Earth in intertwined ecological and social systems are precisely the type of fact that feed into ethics, because ethics needs to know how humans are on all scales as biological objects, that is, as life forms, but also as inhabitants of socially complex systems such as society itself. So figuring out what the human being is on the level of 21st century knowledge from all relevant disciplines, be they the humanities or the so-called natural science, contributes to the heuristics of ethics. So ethical realism, remember, is the claim that there are moral facts to be known. And what I have just said, humanism, is the idea that the way we come to know those moral facts is by studying the human being through all disciplines. So from this perspective, one could say that the goal of a university is to figure out moral facts in virtue of studying the nature of being human from different perspectives. So a new Enlightenment university is precisely in the business of bringing philosophy and science and other sectors of society together with the clear-cut goal of solving the global challenges we are all facing by accepting that they're there and by taking them as a proper subject of investigation and also social change. And last but not least, and I conclude with reflections about that, universalism, or a new universality as the third dimension of the new Enlightenment as I understand it. So realism, humanism, that is insight into the ecological niche construction of the human animal on all levels, physical, biological, social, and historical, and last but not least, new universality. So what we owe to each other in virtue of our shared humanity is nothing that can separate us. So to be human is to exercise the specific human capacity that we can do what we do in light of a conception of ourselves. Or as the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has famously put it, we are self-interpreting animals. Now, the humanities in particular study the nature of said self-interpretation by looking at humans conceive of themselves in science, politics, and technology in particular as central sectors of modern society. And in this way, right, by figuring out how humans are specifically diverse in highly complex systems, so by bringing diversity to the table of human self-interpretation, we can figure out what we owe to each other, right, despite the fact that humans can only realize human becoming locally. So different social formations result in different forms of normativity. Political systems can differ not just between nation states, but obviously also within nation states, which has, for instance, affected the ways in which we are and were fighting the pandemic. So different nation states, different legal systems, and then within nation states, such as Germany being a federal state, again, different, more local legislations. So we have a high form of social complexity, which is the proper object of types of investigation coming from the humanities and social science. We can figure out how social complexity works. By figuring out how social complexity works, we are then able to see what we owe to each other universally. So the new universalism that the new Enlightenment brings to the table is generated bottom up. So you take human diversity, maximal human diversity, meaning diachronic and synchronic variations in being human, right? For instance, we just held a wonderful conference here in Hamburg with indigenous leaders from the Amazon and politicians and humanists and poets discussing precisely different conceptions of being human in certain populations that live in the Amazon forest, but also in some of the mountains in Colombia, how they think about being human compared to how we have been thinking about being human, in particular here in various European contexts. So the new universality, and I conclude with that, is the idea that only transcultural investigation in actual diversity can lead to insight into how to achieve the universal. So the universal is not like in earlier waves of the Enlightenment, something given, grounded in human reason, and not even grounded in human biology. Human biology tells us that we are pro-social animals, right, who flourish best under conditions of high-level cooperation. But that by itself does not, as we can see in the current crisis, help us to overcome geopolitical tensions and fights between identities. So for this reason, the new universal of the new Enlightenment has to be generated bottom up. So we have to give an account of local so-called cultural difference that then contributes to the heuristics that are sketched in the second part. So realism, humanism, and new universality are the three dimensions of the new Enlightenment as I propose it, and I'm looking forward to discussing this in this distinguished group.
Okay, thank you so much for Professor Markus GABRIEL to explain the meanings of new Enlightenment by talking about the moral realism, new type of humanism, and new universality. Okay, so the next speaker is Professor Hiroshi Oguri. So, Professor Oguri, please.
Thank you. Dear distinguished audience, dear distinguished panelists, half a century ago, in 1972, Freeman Dyson delivered the Gibbs Lecture under the auspices of the American Mathematical Society. The lecture series was established 100 years ago to make the public aware of the contribution of mathematics to present-day thinking and to modern civilization. Contrary to this stated purpose, Dyson started his lecture by saying, "As a working physicist, I'm acutely aware of the fact that the marriage between mathematics and physics, which was so enormously fruitful in the past centuries, has recently ended in divorce." He reminded the audience that physics used to inspire progress in mathematics, and the mathematics used to provide powerful theoretical tools for physics. During the middle of the 20th century, however, mathematicians became more interested in making mathematics rigorous and were driven by their own internal logic, while physicists lost interest in sophisticated mathematics. Since Professor Nakajima, who is moderating this session, asked me to comment on possible collaborations between philosophy and physics, it is tempting to follow Dyson's example and lament a dismal state of physicist interaction with philosophers. I could even paraphrase Dyson and say that I'm acutely aware of the fact that the marriage between philosophy and physics, which was so enormously fruitful in the past centuries, has recently ended in divorce. Philosophy and physics used to be closer. In fact, physics was a part of natural philosophy. In the 17th century, the publication of Discourse on the Method by René Descartes played an important role in the development of natural sciences. The book has a chapter on physics in which he discusses the laws of nature, and there is also an interesting discussion on how to tell artificial intelligence from natural ones, such as ours. The question was revisited by Alan Turing in the 20th century and has become even more relevant over the past decade due to the rapid development of machine learning. I'll come to that point later. The collaboration between philosophy and physics continued until the 20th century. Physicists such as Albert Einstein and Werner Heisenberg were deeply influenced by latest philosophical thoughts when they formulated the laws of relativity and quantum mechanics. As is often the case with divorce, it is difficult to figure out who was at fault for the separation between philosophy and physics. Rather than trying to identify the causes, I'd like to point out an irony in the timing of Dyson's lecture in 1972. When he was lamenting the lack of interactions between mathematicians and physicists, a seismic shift was taking place in physics. After decades of confusion, puzzling behavior of elementary particles discovered in accelerator laboratories around the world finally started to make sense in the unified framework of the standard model of particle physics. The standard model makes use of latest ideas in mathematics, and physicists realize the power of modern mathematics in addressing questions about these experiments. It seemed like Dyson was not aware of this development when he delivered the Gibbs lecture, probably because his interest had shifted away from elementary particle physics. Around the same time, problems posed by physics started to inspire new development in mathematics. One of the early examples is Simon Donaldson's discovery of a new differential structure in four-dimensional Euclidean space, which was inspired by physics and for which he received the Fields Medal, one of the highest honors in mathematics. Since then, more than 70% of Fields medals have been awarded to mathematicians who have worked in areas closely related to physics. Such intense collaborations between mathematicians and physicists motivated me and my friends to launch the Institute for the Physics and Mathematics of the Universe, or IPMU, at the University of Tokyo in 2007. At IPMU, collaborations between mathematicians and physicists flourished and produced many significant discoveries over the past 15 years. Now, there are a few lessons one can learn from these experiences of collaborations between mathematicians and physicists, which can perhaps be applied to collaboration between philosophy and physics. One is that we should be careful when we lament the lack of collaborations since opportunities for collaborations are time-dependent, and we may be ignoring a hidden undercurrent of potential collaborations, such as Dyson did. More importantly, interdisciplinary collaboration can succeed if one area has burning questions that can be addressed by ideas and techniques in another area. This brings me to discuss whether there are burning questions in science that require insight of philosophy and are interesting to philosophers as well. Clearly, addressing ethical questions about scientific research requires collaboration of philosophers and scientists. This has already been noted in the introduction of this session. There are many such questions ranging from global climate changes to AI safety and AI alignment. It is important to discuss how to evaluate implications and risks in scientific investigations and their application to the society. It is also important to engage and involve the public in an early stage. Excuse me. Here, however, I would like to propose another question, which is of epistemological nature. It is to clarify what we mean when we say we understand and believe in facts about our world. Let me explain what I mean by this. The concept of discoveries in physics and proofs in mathematics have evolved over the past few decades. The proof of the four-color theorem, announced in 1976 by Kenneth Appel and Wolfgang Heiken, was the first major theorem to be proven using a computer. Initially, there were mathematicians who did not accept it as a proof because the computer-assisted proof was not feasible for a human to check by hand. More recently, some frontier in mathematics had reached such a level of complexity that traditional proof checking by human may no longer be sufficient. That famous example is the classification of finite simple groups, whose proof consists of tens of thousands of pages written by about 100 mathematicians for over half a century. In 1913, Vladimir Vorovsky, who was a field medalist at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, discovered an error in one of his famous papers published a quarter century ago. He spent the rest of his career until his untimely death in 2017, developing formal languages to write mathematical definitions, executable algorithms, and theorems, so that the mathematical proof can be checked by machine. Progress in machine learning has made it possible for computer algorithms not only to check proofs, but to prove new theorems and to discover new laws of nature by experimental data. This summer, a group of theoretical physicists at Google Research presented a new language model called Minerva, which can solve mathematical and scientific questions using step-by-step reasoning. Minerva is pre-trained on general natural language data, and it can answer undergraduate level programs in physics, biology, chemistry, and economics that require, and this is important, quantitative reasoning. Also this year, a group led by Charlie Ho at the Flatiron Institute in New York presented an approach for using machine learning to automatically discover the governing equations and hidden properties of real physical systems from observations. They trained a neural network with 30 years of data about our solar system and used symbolic regression to rediscover Newton's laws of gravitation. Though the law has been known, of course, since Isaac Newton, their results suggest that the machine can discover unknown laws and hidden properties from observed data. These developments raise a question on what we mean when we say we have proven a theorem or discovered the new laws of nature. Are these uses of computer merely an extension of the earlier use of the desktop calculator, or do they require a new definition of our understanding and belief in scientific fact? The question goes beyond academic issues. Many political issues in the world has been caused since people are not capable of revising their beliefs, even if they have been thoroughly refuted by scientific fact. As a working scientist, I am dismayed by people continuing to deny the human causes of climate changes or the usefulness of vaccination. Cognitive scientists have offered explanation for these phenomena. Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber argued that our ability to cooperate, which is our biggest evolutionary advantage over other species, has contributed to our tendency to embrace information that support our beliefs and reject information that contradict them. According to Stephen Sloman and Philip Fehrenbach, our tendency to collaborate and divide labor within a group has made the boundary between my idea and knowledge and those of others blurry. They wrote that strong feelings about issues do not necessarily emerge from deep understanding, and our dependence on other minds reinforces the problem. The title of this panel discussion is Toward New Enlightenment. The previous age of enlightenment was preceded by the scientific revolution and inspired by Descartes' discourse on method and Newton's Principia Mathematica. The Enlightenment encouraged the pursuit of knowledge by means of reason and observed evidence. It was discovered that we can use these scientific methods to correct our evolutionary inclination toward confirmation bias and groupthink. However, after more than 3 centuries, science has developed so much that it has become necessary for scientists themselves to depend on reasoning by other minds, which include artificial mind. At the same time, scientific methods have failed to correct biases and false beliefs of people on issues with significant implications on our future, even on the survival of our civilization. Thus, I'd like to pose this question to the panel. Can philosophers and scientists work together and respond to the situation by offering a new social imaginary for understanding of the world? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your great talk, Professor Oguri. Your talk is relevant to the ethical problem as well as epistemological problem. So now philosophy, especially Professor Markus GABRIEL, is trying to think of how to understand our understanding itself. So maybe philosophy and science can collaborate in this respect altogether. All right, thank you so much. So the next speaker is Professor Lee from Seoul National University. Okay, Professor Lee, please.
Slides, please.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody who is here. I also want to thank Professor Nakajima for organizing this great panel and the all of those here at Tokyo University for making this possible. I'm going to talk about how the past Enlightenment can be understood and how it might be related to what we are talking about today as the new Enlightenment. So next slide. We'll take a quick look at the past. As you all well know, the motto was Aude Sapere, which is dare to know. And if we look back, we know that there were major scientific breakthroughs. Many have already mentioned this, but Newton's Principia, I think, was the culmination of this effort. And what it did was that it provided us with a very different way, a very powerful way of looking at the world and looking at us as well. And this raised various issues about how we should regard our existing framework, particularly our ethical framework. So after a certain period of crises, there was a very strong movement within philosophy to try to address this. And we know this through the works of philosophers such as David Hume and Immanuel Kant. And through the emphasis of the role of reason, they were able to provide a new picture, one that I'll describe briefly in the next slide, as one that addresses the worries that were raised by this new mechanical deterministic system. At the same time, there was this recognition that we as human beings are not standing alone apart from nature, but that we are agents that are very much part of nature. So this kind of naturalistic tendency also emerged to help incorporate the various scientific discoveries that were occurring. Next slide, please. So there's certain significant elements that I think we should be very appreciative of, but there are also limitations, I think, of the old humanities or the old Enlightenment that we should bear in mind. Could we go back to the last slide? Yes. The old Enlightenment, for lack of a better term, provided a new model for humanity, and in this new model, human beings were viewed as rational sovereign agents with intrinsic worth. And the critical emphasis is the intrinsic worth because we're intrinsically valuable. We can't be reduced to anything that's instrumental. And this led to the predominance of a democratic governance system, which is a governance among equal peers. So we're all equal in this regard. And this, I provided a great thrust to an advancement in the human condition. But there was various limitations as well. And I want to focus on this because I think in going forward, I think this is the limitation that we have to overcome. There was a very narrow perspective on the world and a privileging of a particular viewpoint. And what this led to is that the universal values, the intrinsic worth of being human, I think was handed down, as it were, in a very paternalistic manner. And there was a lack of awareness of the maturity and genuine diversity and complexity that was there in other parts of the world as well. And I think this neglect of the value of the particularity and diversity of the various distinct localities that were spread out in the world was an issue for the old Enlightenment. Also, we have to ask whether the solution that they allegedly provided is a solution that really works, which is part of the challenge that we face today. Next slide. So the future, it's about, this conference is about shaping the future, so we should talk about the future. So the future brings new demands and new challenges, and I wanted to bring out three. So one is the world as we know it is broadened, not geographically, but in terms of our recognition of the distinct localities and peculiarities that are there. And I think this is something that we have to appreciate. Second is that there are various new scientific discoveries and challenges that technologies that we have to incorporate as well. The most prominent one, I think, right now is the development of artificial intelligence, and particularly artificial general intelligence, if that's going to occur. And the last but not least is we're literally in a harsher environment, right? The global warming and climate change issues are very pressing, as Secretary General Ban Ki-moon brought out very nicely in his earlier talk. This is one of the issues that we, both philosophers and scientists, have to face and try to solve. Now, these are the new challenges and new demands that are presented to us, but I'm an historian of philosophy, so I always like to bring up the past as well, so you have to forgive me for that. But there are recurring demands and challenges that are present as well. And one is the repression of basic human rights that are still going on at a very broad level, and the alarming recurrence of authoritarianism, the kind of authoritarianism that Immanuel Kant argued against in his very nice piece, What is Enlightenment? And with this, there's a neglect of the fundamental role of reason. Reason is a capacity that is very important for us to move forward, and I think this neglect is very problematic. And last is the incredible economic disparity that exists all across the world, which is another concern that we have to face. So we have the recurring demands of the past, along with the new challenges. So we're facing a greater increased demand and challenge. So the last slide. So it's interesting that we all seem to be sort of focusing on the same group of issues. And I want to bring your attention to a new type of connectedness or integration that I think is emerging in the recent years as well. And what this is that I mentioned localities and particularities, but the localities have lost their isolation because the localities seem to include within themselves a kind of crossroads of old and new and east and west. And let me just talk about two examples that are very brief. There's a K-culture, particularly K-drama, is receiving a lot of attention and it's gaining worldwide popularity. And if you look at, say, Squid Games, it's a very local depiction of what's going on within the confines of Korean society. But as you can see, the themes and the issues that are emerging are not just unique to Korea, but they express problems that are they're all across the world. So I think this kind of universality that's embedded in the local context is what makes it very interesting. Another example that I want to bring out is the work of one of my favorite authors, Katsuo Ishiguro. And if you look at his work, I think his being slightly distinct from the English society which he's depicting allows him to describe what it is to be part of that society in a way that's more incisive and more insightful than one who would be just squarely within that society and be identical to it. So I think these two examples, and I think we can find more, are cases where the global seems to be the local and the local is the global. So this is the kind of new universality that I want to present. It was interesting that Professor Gabriel also had an account of new universality that he's mentioning. And mine, actually, I have to confess, isn't new. And again, as a historian, I tend to look back. And the German philosopher who was active in Hanover, Germany, Gottfried Leibniz, had coined this term called universal expression. And what universal expression is that every facet, every particular fact in itself incorporates and expresses the world or the universe around it. And I think this is a very nice idea that we can sort of revive as we go forward. This idea was not popular in Leibniz's own lifetime, though he was part of the Enlightenment. I think it was in a way, in some ways, too advanced for those to fully embrace. And it's universality that I think can truly incorporate diversity and complexity. We always argue, we always suggest that diversity and complexity must be incorporated, but how to do it in an actual manner, how to really achieve the appreciation of diversity and complexity within a universal focus, I think, has been an issue. And this idea that that Leibniz expressed, unum ex pluribus, right? A oneness from many, I think, is one of the ways that we might try to go forward. Another key distinctive feature of this kind of universality that I'm thinking about is that if we go back to the example of Ishiguro and K-culture, there can be many universalities now, right? So it isn't a universality that one region or one culture or one people present paternalistically to others and say, accept this. It's rather a kind of universality that each locality all over the world, they can each contain, they can each express, and through this kind of competing arena of distinct local universalities, I think we can all try to tackle the issues ahead of us. I emphasize this because what we're trying to do here is to see whether there can be a genuine dialogue between philosophy and science. And Professor Oguri, at the end of his talk, raised a very relevant, important question. Are we ready for this? And I think the kind of universality that I've been arguing for might provide the basis for all the participants in the world to come together to face this challenge. Immanuel Kant, lived in a small port city far away from London and Paris. And who would have imagined that this person who never left his hometown of Königsberg to come up with a theory that accounted for why we should accept Newtonian physics while still thinking that we're free. So I think by addressing this type of new local universality, we can encourage the new generation to tackle our goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee, for your stimulating talk. By shedding light on the contrast between new enlightenment and old enlightenment, we come to understand the difference between, say, top-down universality and bottom-up universality. So now we are facing the bottom-up universality, which includes the diversity and complexity. And yes, it is mainly based upon locality or indigenous knowledge. So maybe we can talk about universalizing instead of universalizability in this respect. Anyway, thank you so much. Okay, so the last but not least speaker is Professor Oki. So Professor Oki, please.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I thank all the organizers and the staffs for giving me this precious occasion, and also I thank all the participants to come here a long way to be with us. I am a historian of science and working mainly on the early modern period, I mean 18th and 19th century. And today I'm asked to talk about communications to bridge science and philosophy. But however, as a historian, I have a bad habit to look back at the history always. And I wonder how today's situation is so different from the historical past as to the difficulty of communications between science and philosophy. Well, you may be shocked by my question, but I need to be sure that we do not repeat the same question again and again before proceeding to the next step. So for that reason, I will trace back a little bit the history, especially to the diverging point of science and philosophy, and then explain how science, philosophy was diverged and so on. Please, next slide. Well, we know from historical past that free speech, the basis of democracy, cannot be easily separated from misperception and disinformation, especially when the discussion touches on political or moral issues. For example, Socrates in this image, one of the great Greek philosophers in ancient time, he was a victim of the fake news, we can say that. In fact, he was sentenced to death penalty in democratic Athens, under the influence of fake rumors about him. He was accused of impiety and of corrupting the youth. So he was accused of being a kind of bad guy. And probably being fully conscious of that ancient example, the next generations, but I really skipped a little bit the ages. For example, the first founders of the learned societies, like universities and academies, I especially talk about academies because I study on that institutions. So the founders of the learned academies, which pursues all the academic and philosophical endeavors, they were preoccupied to establish a space for dialogue, quiet dialogue, without fierce polemics or bloody fights. Especially in the late Renaissance period, so the way of thinking is like that. And I have the impression that this process contributed partly to developing the practice and especially the vision to separate science from philosophy, because philosophy is always, how to say it, a little bit preoccupied by moral issues, and so it's difficult to eliminate this kind of debate or fight from that kind of discussion. Next, please. Well, in this 17th and 18th century, we know that philosophy and science were not separated. Isaac Newton perceived himself as a natural philosopher, so he thought himself was a philosopher. Even in the middle of the 18th century, we see the a page a page of the encyclopedia. It's kind of a great encyclopedia of the 18th century, edited by Diderot and D'Alembert, French philosophers. That encyclopedia considered all the scientific fields as the product of philosophical spirit. So sciences are created by philosophical mind. However, toward the end of the era of Enlightenment, we know the divergence of science and philosophy. Next, please. A German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, seems to be a witness of that divergence. In his Pure Critics of Reason, published in the 1780s, Kant argues who the philosopher is and how he or she how philosopher is different from, I quote, the mathematician, the naturalist, the logician, end of quote. They are those whom we might call roughly scientists in today's term. The term scientist did not exist in Kant's day. Kant classifies here the philosopher as a legislator of human reason, so someone who makes laws and norms. While the mathematician, Kant says, the mathematician, the naturalist, and the logician, they are the artists of reason. So artist. Please note here that the original German term of artist in German, Vernunftkünstler, it can be translated into rather craftsman or artisan of reason in the meaning of 18th century. So Kant tried to distinguish these things. Kant also says that the ancient, I quote, the ancients understood by the name of philosopher first and foremost the moralist. So philosopher was a kind of moralist for Kant. His interpretation introduces as such the idea of epistemological distinctiveness between the moral and physical sciences. Next, please. Another episode revealed more clearly that natural scientific knowledge was increasingly seen as distinct from other forms of knowledge. In the 1840s, William Whewell, a British philosopher, coined the term scientist. For Whewell, a scientist is no more a philosopher, but a specialist who worked for a specific field, no more expected to have a broad perspective, nor to be anxious about the moral outcome of one's research. Modern society needed that kind of specialist-minded scientist as a symbol or reliable stabilizer of the social order, especially after having experienced the political difficulties, turmoils created by the French Revolution in Europe. And during the 19th century, many countries developed a system for expert control during the process of modernization. The process was urged by the needs of the times, but also based on the optimistic assumption that scientific experts can give society neutral and value-free advice, helping the political decision of both the government and citizens. And it seems that the role of philosophy have diminished considerably in this process during the 19th century, and probably until the middle of the 20th century. Next, please. But however, the situation changed dramatically during the latter half of the 20th century. The importance of philosophy, especially ethical thinking, began to be reaffirmed, and philosophy was demanded to be reinserted into the scientific research process. It is because there has been a growing awareness that many of the issues which arising in the course of the interaction between science or technology and society, were indeed trans-scientific problems. Trans-scientific problems are the problems which cannot be asked of science, and yet which cannot be answered by science. So trans-scientific problems often concern moral, cultural, or social elements, and cannot be solved by science alone, though we cannot handle them without science. So we are in the dilemma. So take the example of constructing new nuclear power plants. It can never be a value-free issue. And public opinion remained to be divided always, despite the level of scientific knowledge of each individual. We observe that even experts in science and technology cannot help but develop a biased judgment according to the value they share in the group of where they belong. Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster gave us a painful lesson about it 10 years ago. Nuclear engineers were not able to take into serious consideration on the alert coming from a geologist finding in the beginning of 21st century. That alert was about a possible outcome of tsunami disaster. So it was predicted by experts, but engineers were not able to take them seriously. Today, so we began to try embedding ethical, legal, and social evaluation in scientific research and innovation process as much as possible, as is shown in the development of concepts like RLE and LC. When the research is expected to have a social impact, the involvement of the wider stakeholders, including lay people, is recommended since the beginning of the research. Next, please. Well, philosophy is now demanded everywhere, but today's situation gives us new challenges, as were remarked by Professor Gabriel and Professor Lee. We need to create a truly inclusive dialogue that we have never had in historical past, by reaching as well as possible those excluded people from the old system. They are especially women, disabled persons, cultural or ethnic minorities, and other underprivileged individuals. The Enlightenment was the attempt to old Enlightenment was the attempt to pursue a better society through transparent discussions among individuals perceived as morally autonomous and rational. In fact, they were not. Well, if we can imagine a new Enlightenment, Professor Gabriel explained it in his brilliant way. But if I add something, I can say like that: if there is a new Enlightenment, it will be accomplished only by overcoming the difficulty of communication among really diverse individuals, and it is really a difficult task. But because for that purpose, we should learn both in theory and practice how to deal with a really opaque, complex dialogue among individuals with limited rationality, and each of whom, everyone has bias and groupthink. And everyone is bound to this standpoint according to their own attributes, such as social status, gender, and sexuality, and race, and geographical positioning, so everything local. I think two things are at least necessary for it. One is to find a means to protect vulnerable groups or individuals who become more easily targeted or harassed by misperception and disinformation than others in the discussion. For example, women can be easily harassed during the discussion. And as far as I know, so it is really important. And I add also that in some contexts, scientists and philosophers could be also included at that kind of vulnerable group because they are minority. If we think of the case of Socrates, and the second thing is to continue really serious efforts to design the setting of the effective dialogue. by improving our knowledge of human emotion and value and identity. I hope this session will be a part of these efforts for a better future. So thank you for your listening.
Thank you, Professor Oki, for your very fruitful presentation. On the one hand, you are trying to get back the conceptual history of each concept, including philosophy, science. And on the other hand, you are focusing on the current problematics for philosophy and science, especially on the ethical thinking. So President Fuji referred to ELSC, ethical, legal, and social important problems. So maybe we are facing this type of ethical problem right now. So our tasks based upon new enlightenment should shed light on this theme. Okay, so now we are jumping into a discussion moment. So each presenter has 4 minutes, 4 minutes for comments and questions to other participants. So first is Professor Markus GABRIEL, please.
Well, thank you all. A lot of food for thought and interesting and important contributions to the idea of a new enlightenment. So I will respond to some of the things that have been said by the other speakers somewhat in order. So let's start with this important, with an important dimension concerning the relationship between philosophy and the so-called natural sciences, or rather science and technology, right? So as came out also already in the keynote addresses for the Tokyo Forum, science and technology are not, as it were, merely value-free activities. So the implementation of physical insight from physics into non-physical environments, such as, socio-economic forms of transformation, or the geopolitical situation that we're currently in. Just think of the threat of nuclear war, or the intertwinement of the geopolitical situation with the energy sector. All of this, of course, plus the weapons that need to be produced on both sides of the aggressor and the group that is defending itself against aggression. All of these things are, of course, products of science and technology, just as the increasing way in modes in which science skepticism is spread through the most advanced scientific technology. So without the internet, we wouldn't have the type of fake news and the way in which fake news are spread that leads even to a crisis of democracy in the way in which we witness it right now. So I do think that there should be enough occasion for philosophy and also physics in particular to engage in a much deeper dialogue. Last night, we had a long discussion here at the New Institute with, after Takahiro Nakajima's talk, with physicists, for instance, precisely about perfect numbers, right? So it's a particular genre of numbers and how perfect numbers are used in physics. So we had a long discussion also about precisely an idea by the famous quantum physicist Eugene Wigner, the question why logics and reality even hang together in such a way that we are able to understand nature by deploying the scientific method, in particular mathematical concepts. So I think there's enough work really to be done at the deep mathematical level even of physics. And I think that all of this can contribute to ethical insight. So the idea is not that top-down ethics knows what we ought to do, for instance, with nuclear energy, or how to transform our economy and create a new social imaginary, and then we just implement the philosophical idea. The philosophical thought has to emerge from a deep integration of knowledge acquisition, because questions such as what is it for humans to be animal, or what is it for facts to exist, and what is it for humans to be capable of understanding the universe, for instance, in mathematical terms, all those questions contribute to answering, or answering those questions contributes to answering the ethical questions. So the ethical search for a better society and for better modes of integration on our human end as we are facing complex problems, all of this needs to be grounded in a deep, profound interdisciplinary research. So I believe that philosophers should be at the table with AI research and working with physicists and colleagues from all disciplines, but always with a common goal. The common goal is to understand what it is to be human in the 21st century on all the scales, right? So for instance, the idea, the old Enlightenment idea of just the rational animal is completely misguided, as we know, thanks to all forms of, insight from behavioral economics, physics, neuroscience, cognitive science, and all the life sciences together. So what it takes right now is precisely to bring the disciplines together again after too much specialization, and to create a type of curriculum that allows us to really address the types of questions that make a larger society, that is also non-academic sectors, rightly nervous. I think that should be the function of the university in the new Enlightenment.
Okay, thank you so much. So next comment from Professor Oguri. Professor Oguri, please.
Thank you very much. So it has been a very interesting session. And for scientists like me, it's very eye-opening to hear perspective from philosophers. I should start by saying that the scientists like myself are very practical people. And our sort of criteria are whether things are useful or not. And so I'd like to bring that perspective to this discussion. So we have been talking about the old Enlightenment and the necessity to update it and perhaps create the new Enlightenment to solve variety of problems that it has been pointed out. Well, I would like to point out that this old Enlightenment, inspired by the scientific revolution, was successful because it provided the specific sets of methods. And in fact, it was in the title of the book, Descartes, the discourse of the method. So the book had impact because he provided a very specific set of methods to solve problems. Of course, it was a limited set of problems, but these methods solved the problem. Of course, clearly there are problems that can not be solved by these methods. And even scientists like myself are faced with a question on what we mean when we say we understand and believe in facts about the world, as I pointed out. Also, there are many other societal issues. I also pointed out that people are not capable of revising their beliefs, even if they have been thoroughly refuted by scientific facts, and how to confront this fact and come up with understanding. Professor Oki pointed out that there are trans-scientific problems, such as global climate change or how to use nuclear energy, which cannot be solved by scientific methods alone. We need new way to come to agreement. How to involve a diverse group of people to solve these problems together, that's becoming increasingly important. For the new Enlightenment to be successful, we need to provide or update and come up with a specific and well-articulated set of methods. And the challenging is that, so there have been very, very inspiring discussion about the moral realism and universality. And clearly, in order to solve problems that we are facing, we need to incorporate these perspectives. But the question, the challenges I would like to pose to this panel is how to translate these ideas into specific sets of methods of discourse. As I said, scientists like me are practical people, and our criterion on the validity of the method is whether they are useful or not. And so perhaps we scientists can bring such practical attitude in our collaboration with philosophers to come up with a new method. And come up with an idea of how to agree on statement regarding, for example, the responsible use of sciences. And when the challenge is that when we involve a diverse group of people, how we can argument scientific method. And it has been pointed out, of course, that it shouldn't be like top-down or forced upon to people. But, and then it might seem like coming up with a method is in that direction. But I think we do need some well-articulated rules of discourse. And that's what we might call a new imaginary, so that we can make practical progress in solving these important problems. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for your clarification and deepening our, way of thinking. All right, so next commentator is Professor Lee. Please, Professor Lee.
Yes, thank you as well to all the speakers today. And it provided me with a lot to think about, really, about how we address this issue. I think both Professor Gabriel and Professor Oguri raise the critical question, and it is whether, as we engage in this attempt to articulate a new enlightenment, whether these efforts of ours can really measure up to the success of the old enlightenment. Philosophers are pessimistic by nature, so despite the fact that I try to put on a good face and argue for what might be a basis for a project in the new enlightenment, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's not possible. We really have to ask whether the kind of foundations we need to go forward, say the kind of moral realism that Professor Gabriel is basing his new enlightenment on, whether that can be secured. The issue that Professor Oguri raised about method, I think, is a very important one, because in the first Enlightenment, there was no disagreement among the participants that this basis and focus on reason will lead us out of the kind of abysmal, dire state we were in. But as we go forward now, as has been pointed out, there is no agreement on the proper method as we go forward. So, and then as Professor Oki presented very nicely, if we look back and compare the situation in the past and the situation in the present, are we better at communicating our differences? And in this age of social media, many people have said this, so I don't want to repeat it, but it looks as if we're doing worse. So I think the challenges we face as we coin this term, New Enlightenment, are immense, and perhaps the beginning is to acknowledge this shortcoming that we face. Let me just mention one more, and this is one that I think Professor Oguri was sort of hinting at, but didn't point out that explicitly. But the kind of task that Kant succeeded in doing in allowing the deterministic new mechanistic physics of Kant to be relevant, as well as trying to maintain our view of free will and sort of bringing these together was a marvelous feat. And if we think about the most pressing question that physics presents to us right now, namely a kind of understanding of how quantum mechanics and relativity can come together, and how this worldview, what that worldview means to us as human beings who are navigating this world, I think these issues are still left with without a viable account of how to understand that right now. So I like to go forward. I wish we were going to go forward. I think this dialogue is the beginning, but accepting the dire situation right now, I think, is the genuine beginning. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very, critical thinking. So the fourth comment comes from Professor Oki. So Professor Oki, please.
Yes, it's a bit difficult to say something after those brilliant comments. Well, I'm a historian, and I'm a little bit practical and a little bit ideal. So, because Professor Oguri said that scientists are really practical people, I feel I'm in between. And first of all, I'm really, impressed by the possibility that Professor Gabriel talked about a new enlightenment, especially, I feel really impressed by his way of, sorry, I just look for my notes, sorry. Oh yeah, the possibility to understand what human being is using our knowledge with making collaborate different fields and different diverse people from all places of the world. It is really the dream of diversity and the dream of enlightenment, I think. So I'm really feel optimistic listening to his discussion. At the same time, there is, there's another thing. I'm also optimistic about the possibility of dialogue, especially to have a dialogue. We can also work together, putting many people from many different sections of fields to make a collective intelligence to think together. So at practical level, I have the impression that we have many things to do, and we have kind of a broad perspective about it and about the bright future. But at the same time, I have one question after listening to all of you. It is about the understanding. Let me explain a little bit. Professor Oguri has talked about the recent interesting findings in the recent intellectual discoveries using artificial intelligence. Discovery is not a good verb. Anyway, I was interested by that, by your story that artificial intelligence became capable to find again Newton's gravitation law. So it is anyway. Some artificial intelligence can solve problems in physics, a question in physics, especially if they are quantitative. So, do we call it understanding of the natural phenomena? I think many philosophers now are discussing about it. So I don't have the intention to add something to it. But anyway, this situation makes us rethink about what is the question, like what is understanding. I mention it because I have another question, especially when Professor Gabriel and Professor Lee also probably say that understanding of human beings is important. What kind of understanding do we need, and are we satisfied with the one way of understanding? And I am afraid that there would be really a multitude, different, diverse way of understandings for that. I say it because I think of one author in the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and in fact, I'm not a good reader of Rousseau. And Rousseau is someone really difficult person who says always that, oh, you don't understand what I mean in my book. And he was really anxious about the interpretation of his words, his discourse. So he was not satisfied with the other's understanding of himself. So another more easier example is like that. You don't understand my feeling. For example, if someone says it to you, what do you think? So understanding human beings seems really difficult and complex task. And so I think there would be a really huge question. I mean, this new enlightenment gives us huge questions. What understanding is meaningful to us? So, so I'm really thankful to all the discussants and all the participants to give me this interesting question. So it is my comment. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for your brilliant comment. Okay, so everyone realizes that we should continue this stimulating dialogue much further, but due to time constraint, it is time to wrap up this wonderful session. So, as you know, it is almost impossible to wrap up this stimulating dialogue into one word, but I'd like to try to say something about it. So, thinking of new enlightenment, we have to think of the transformation or radical transformation of our social imaginary created by philosophy and science. So in this respect, philosophy should change itself while science should change itself, right? The old meaning of reflection is to bend together, right? So maybe we need a much deeper reflection between philosophy and science by seeking for the way of understanding of humans. We need a new interpretation of humans. I dare to say, we had to better think of human co-becoming instead of human being. So if we are allowed to think human co-becoming in new imaginary, we can also think of the new collaboration between science and philosophy, talking about ethics, a foundation of ethics, and a new way of understanding of our understanding or trans-scientific problems, etc. So it is time for us to seriously start our own dialogue between philosophy and science. So today's talk by 4 distinguished guests encourage us to go forward this way. So by the name of New Enlightenment, we are asked to jump into the new dimension of thinking. Thank you so much for everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor Nakajima, Professor Gabriel, Professor Oguri, Professor Lee, and Professor Oki for such an interesting session, bringing philosophy and science together and giving us ideas about how to think about our dire situations in new, better ways. Please give them another round of applause.